I don't find much comfortable in Jesus, to be honest. I find him the strangest of all the gods. One of the most disturbing things that Jesus ever says, will you please stop worrying?
We literally are now calling this the anxious generation. It seems harder than ever for people to put that into practice.
Technology, medicine, the rest of it has the poison and the remedy within it. And as soon as you just say, this is a bad thing, I want nothing to do with it, you've lost nuance.
We need to have fidelity to the unexplainable.
If atheism were true, I believe it would be morally right to accept it. Christianity is a better vision of reality, only if it is true.
You don't want to pick a beautiful lie over the terrible truth. We may actually have too many stories at our disposal.
What makes storytelling so integral to the human experience?
This podcast is supported by Stewardship, helping Christians be the best stewards of the resources that God gives them.
Radical generosity has always been central to the Christian story. Stewardship helps make it part of your everyday life.
For over a century, Stewardship has been working with generous Christians and the ministries they support.
They help you give well and see your generosity make a real difference.
If you want to give generously and wisely, a Stewardship Giving Account makes that simple.
You can support over 12,000 registered charities and ministries with ease, and even build a balance to set aside funds for when the right moment or opportunity comes.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
Re-Enchanting listeners, it is Belle here, and I have a favour to ask of you. We have been doing Re-Enchanting for coming up to 3 years now. We are slowly but surely making our way to 100th episode, and I realise that in all of that time, we have never intentionally reached out and asked you what you think of the show. So that's what I'm here to do. Now, in an ideal world, I would be able to take you all out for a coffee. I would be able to ask you your thoughts. I'd be able to ask you our signature question. But seeing as that isn't possible, instead what I've done is I've written a survey, and I would be so thankful if you would fill that out for me. It is short and sweet. It shouldn't take you more than a few minutes. I just want to know what you think, what you love, what you don't love, what you want more of, what you want less of, and anything else you want to tell me. So the link to it is close by, and I cannot wait to sift through your thoughts. Me and the team, seeing as we do this all with you and we do it for you, I can't wait to hear what you think. I am eternally grateful for your time, and I will see you soon.
Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I'm Belle Tyndall.
And I'm Justin Briley.
And we're speaking about our favourite topic, re-enchantment. Are we missing it? Are we craving it? Are we seeking it? And if so, is the Christian story a place where we can find it?
And in this season 8 finale, we are so pleased to be joined again by Martin Shaw, storyteller and mythologist, who joined us on Re-Enchanting some 2 years ago to tell us about his mystical encounter on a 100-day forest vigil retreat that led to his embrace of Christianity. Go back and listen to that episode if you haven't. It's absolutely wonderful. I think it was season 3, Belle, if my memory serves me right. But Martin is back, I'm glad to say. He's got a new book, Liturgies of the Wild, weaving his own journey with the many folk tales and stories he's gathered throughout his life to re-enchant the God story for a new generation of seekers. So we're really looking forward to having you on the show today, Martin.
Hello, you two. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, our pleasure. I do feel like, Martin, and I promise I'm not just saying this, but since the moment we wrapped up our last conversation, I've been looking forward to this one.
Oh, good. I'm so pleased to hear it.
Oh, yeah, truly. And I think so many of our listeners will feel the same. You are still the episode that people speak to me about the most, I think. So he's back, everybody, and you're welcome.
No pressure, Martin, but, you know, that's quite the introduction.
It can only be a crushing disappointment.
Absolutely not? Okay, right. We always start the same way. And last time, I think you were reading Moby Dick was your answer last time. Yeah. I remember you saying it was so like aggressively masculine. You craved a bit of Virginia Woolf afterwards.
Did. Yeah.
So this time, Martin, what are you reading?
Well, I sort of suspected you may begin with this question, so I've come forearmed and prepared, but these are genuinely what I'm reading. So we find ourselves now in winter. We're coming out of Christmas, and often for some of us, the pressure to have a good time or a sacred time over Christmas, then leading into that long stretch, January, February, March, can be what the Irish call tough country. And I have a book for that. And the book, I'll show it to you.
Our thoughts determine our lives. Is that what I read?
By a fellow called Elder Thaddeus. So this would be an Orthodox teacher. And he deals with, for me, one of the most disturbing things that Jesus ever says. And Jesus says this repeatedly. He says, will you please stop worrying? And for most of us, we're so wired for worry. We live in a culture where anxiety has never been more prevalent. It's a phenomenal book for just calming yourself down. And going into, teachings from the Bible, some patristic wisdom. The fellow himself had 2 massive nervous breakdowns in his life, I think. So he's not unscarred by anxiety himself. So actually, as I look at the long stretch ahead till spring, Elder Thaddeus would be a good companion for all of us.
I love that. What's your second book, Martin? It sounded like you had another one lined up.
I have a few. I really will get them done. So this is a bit. This is a tremendous book. I'll show it there.
Well, tell us the title and the name, just for those who are just listening on audio.
Wisdom in Christian Tradition, the Patristic Roots of Modern Russian Sophiology. It's by a fellow called Marcus Plested, who is a great thinker, really, a modern thinker about orthodoxy. That's what I've been sort of suffused in for the last few years. I know Marcus because he and his beloved wife, who's a great iconographer, amongst other things, they are often in Walsingham. Where I'm often in Walsingham. So over in Norfolk, there is an old, believe it or not, it's an old railway station that has been turned, I think probably in the 60s, into a kind of pilgrims Orthodox chapel. So amongst the Mariology of that place, amongst a heavy Catholic footfall, we've got this tiny little Orthodox chapel, and they're often in there. In fact, I myself was the keeper of the keys very, very briefly in November. So that's another book where he is looking at predominantly a group of Russian immigrant theologians, probably I'd say in the 20s and 30s in Paris, and they're kind of emerging from the revolution and putting their thoughts together. And it's easy when you look at something like orthodoxy, the sense of history and tradition seems so emphatic. You can miss the fact that Holy Spirit is present and innovation is present and new ideas come. And so he's a great one for tracking that. So those are 2 books that I'd recommend.
Excellent. We love hearing what our guests are currently reading, and those sound like two really good books for people who even perhaps aren't part of the Orthodox tradition.
For sure.
To get into. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the anxiety thing, absolutely. We literally are now calling this the anxious generation, aren't we? And it seems like Jesus's words about do not worry, which do crop up, as you say, a surprising number of times. It's hard. It seems harder than ever for people to put that into practice. But I have to say your book possibly is one way in which people could start to engage this, because there's something about the way you write, Martin, that I'm trying to find the way to put this. It's poetic, it's lyrical, but it's also got this sort of groundedness that I think we're lacking in our culture today, that sort of grounds you in something bigger than yourself, that goes a lot further back than yourself. And that, for me, is part of the answer to this kind of constant anxiety people have about having to kind of do everything at 100 miles an hour and everything. It's like, slow down. There's been people who've been thinking, producing extraordinary wisdom over millennia. Let's stop and ask whether we might be able to learn a thing or two about our current predicament from them. So looking forward to leaping into this. You kindly sent me last year an early copy of it, Martin, and I without any sort of exaggeration, I was able to send back a little bit of blurb to say, this is my book of 2025, because it was just such a joy to read. It was just so, it sort of, it sort of fed my soul, you know, and I know that can be a cliche, but it honestly did. So thank you again for writing this. I suppose just as we get in then, you are a storyteller. Okay. What makes storytelling so integral to the human experience in the end?
Well, I think, you know, the theme of anxiety is a good way in, because I think actually when we feel profoundly outside any kind of guiding narrative, we do get very existential. We do get anxious. This isn't just a Christian condition, it's a human condition. And I've been thinking recently that for the first time in my life, I'd probably suggest that we may actually have too many stories at our disposal at this point. Or I would correct that slightly and say we don't have enough of the right kind of stories. Because a lot of you know, from the moment we turn our phone on in the morning, or some of us don't even turn it off anymore, we just charge the thing, we are being flooded with, you know, endless persuasions of one kind or another. We are given the kind of Instagram lifestyle that most of us can't possibly come up with, especially at 7 o'clock in the morning, where we're feeling like a crumpled up crisp packet after a rough night's sleep. So, funnily enough, we need stories to orientate ourselves in the travails of life, but if it can, I would argue that the stories, and to use a big word, myth, it's more than just things to settle us down in the face of the turbulence of life. I would hope that a myth actually qualifies at its root as what you could call a sacred story. And a sacred story intimates that there's something beyond all this, there's something bigger. And you sort of circled around it a minute ago. Ironically, even though we live in, you know, a society obsessed with personal individuation, if you are ultimately not in service to something bigger than your own passions, bigger than your own desires, no matter how much you gain, you tend to end up rather neurotic. So after 30 years of telling stories, 30 years of thinking about this particular question, why do we need stories and what makes a good story? I would say a very simple thing. The stories we tend to remember are a combination of what you could call the timeless and the time-bound. The timeless and the time-bound. If they are only timeless, if they are only perennial wisdoms, they have no postcode attached to them. They have no zip code. They don't quite touch our life. You think, well, that's great for someone living on the top of a mountain, but what's that got to say about Stoke Newington, you know? The time-bound, of course, is the worry, the betrayals, the anxiety, the scuffs of life that we are all inevitably going to encounter. We all have to carry across. There's something bespoke laid out for all of us. And if that is all that you have, and there is no dimension of meaning behind it, that can just in the end be rather disillusioning. And it's too small for humans. It's too small a life. It's too petty a life. So it's this combination of the timeless and the time-bound. When they come together, and as I'm talking to you now, I'm thinking about a story as famous as the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. So there's this fella Odysseus. He's trying to get back to the island of Ithaca. He's been through a terrific war. Many of us are going through terrific wars, battles, struggles of some kind or another. And the route back to his wife, back to beloved Ithaca, is going to take him, you know, the best part of 20 years and all sorts of encounters on the way. Now, I would have told that story to returning veterans. I would have told it to single mums. I would have told it to professors. I would have told it in prisons. I would have told it to recovering junkies. It takes almost nothing for anybody listening to it to situate yourself very quickly in the boat with this fella. And so that's that combination of the pebble in the shoe, which is the lived experience, the fall in a way, but this sense that there is something greater. but there are going to be obstacles along the way. So those are the stories that I think we come back to. It's that combination.
I absolutely, that sounds absolutely right. I love that idea of the timeless and the time bound, and because it has to mean something to you, it has to speak to your own life. But then there's a difference between, as it were, kind of, there's lots of stories floating around, but then you get people like you, Martin, who are brilliant at telling them. Is there a bit of a secret sauce as well in the way you tell that story, as well as obviously the content and the meaning behind it?
Yeah, in a way, I come from a storytelling family, but we never regarded it officially as some kind of tradition that we were the torchbearers of. We just love, as the Irish say, good crack. We like to talk and catch up. And so I'd often come in from the pub when I was about 16, maybe lubricated by a couple of beers, and I'd sit down with mum and dad, and storytelling just would sort of ebulliently arrive in the room one way or another. The thing, if anybody's interested in stories, I always suggest, no matter how grand the story, this isn't a reenactment fair. You don't need to wear a cloak. You don't need to write it all down. Just tell it as if you're telling something on the phone or in a cafe to a pal of yours that you're excited by. Because actually, when you hear great storytelling, there's a kind of eloquence at play, but it's not the kind of eloquence that comes from swallowing a thesaurus. It's not the eloquence that comes from a recital. It's just and this is something I've said a lot, so forgive me. It's your wild way of telling the truth. It's your wild way of telling the truth. And isn't that interesting? Because myth is so often considered a word meaning a fiction or a misnomer. But actually, until I discovered myth, I didn't have a profound experience of the truth of living. Myths seem to tell us a lot about the conditions of our lives, and what they do is they amplify the images. If you go to a good psychologist, one of the ways they can work, and I approve of this heartily, is by reducing the heat and bringing everything down to a manageable level. Stories and storytellers don't traffic in that. We make it writ large. So it's not, there's monsters involved, and there's long night sea journeys, and there's encounters in caves, and there's paradox, and there's forests. So actually you enter this is an interesting idea. N.T. Wright would be interested in this, Tom Wright. You go from lyric to epic. So lyric is the evangelical, beautifully personal feeling that Jesus is talking to you, and that's how wonderful is that? I'd never want to not have that. But the epic is when you are actually writ large on a much, much bigger, more dramatic stage. One of the things that, if you ask me what I'm reading at the moment, one of the things that I've been reading is a very slow line-by-line reading of the story of Abraham. It's taken about a week. It's taken me about a week to get through that. For some reason, other characters land very quickly in my imagination. It could be Ruth and Naomi. It could be Esau. I can't get enough of Esau. Love Esau, the hairy fella. He's great. He's charismatic. And then Abraham seems so important, and the story is so long. One of the things that the Bible does for me is that it's opened my head up to sort of intergenerational storytelling, not storytelling that's taking place in a few days or weeks, but something that is over the span of many, many lifetimes. And God, maker, seeds something hundreds of years before it shows up. But there's this, my ways are not your ways. It's for simple human beings, bears with little brain. It can be terribly mystifying what on earth he's up to. But one of the things I've been enjoying in myth recently is that epic big picture. And after a lifetime of finding it or glimpses of it in other traditions, I've been locating it in the Bible.
So beautiful. I think there's something about communicating through myth and story. I think poetry also comes into this as well. Where part of the beauty of it is that there's this elusivity, sort of you can't catch it, pin it down, and kind of stick it there and say, this is what it means. This is what it meant then. This is what it means now. Like there's, I think you you talk, I think it might even be in your conclusion, you talk about shooting the bird out of the sky. Like, don't do that with story. You know, so story is a way in which we can make meaning, not make meaning, read meaning, decipher meaning, discern meaning, without shooting the bird out of the sky and thinking that, and boxing it in, I think as well is such a valuable part of myth.
Yes, beautifully put. Otherwise, you're left with a pamphlet. So, for example, this very evening, I will begin for 5 nights. I will tell the story of the Holy Grail for 5 nights, 2 hours a night. And one of the things, of course, that people are always trying to get at me is quite, what is the Holy Grail? Will you please pin it down? Can you give us a 3-point program for the Holy Grail? What exactly is it? How do I know it's a real Grail? How do I know it's not a poison chalice? Well, you're robbing the thing of the adventure. You have shot the bird out of the sky. You've got a mission statement or an allegory, but you haven't got a mystery. You haven't got a mystery. And actually, human beings are wired for mystery, because life is essentially mysterious. Back to the notion of anxiety. The poet Keats has an interesting, he wrote a letter to his brother, and he talked about our capacity to develop something called negative capability. Now, negative capability, as far as I understand it, is our capacity to live in a certain degree of paradox, is to live in a certain degree of not knowing. And actually, when stories are robbed of personal experience, the worst thing in the world as a storyteller is when you finish the story and then you turn with a knowing look to your audience and say, and what that all meant is... And I give this freely to anybody that's interested in storytelling, whether you're a preacher or you're an actor, whoever you are, whether you're telling stories to your kids. There's a beautiful way in that doesn't insult the story you've just told. Just ask the people who've heard it. Just say, where do you find yourself in the tale? Where do you find yourself in the tale? Are you with Sarah in the tent listening to the 3 strange angels telling your husband that you're about to have a kid, and you're thinking, well, I'm cute, but I'm also 75 years old, whatever she is. Where do you orientate yourself in the story? Because actually, it's very rare that an entire story lands perfectly from A to B within us. But I can almost guarantee you there will be a moment where an image claims your imagination and bang, you're in.
This episode is brought to you by Stewardship, a Christian charity making generosity simple and intentional.
A Stewardship Giving Account gives you one place to manage all of your giving, regular or one-off, available 24/7.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
So your book, and I won't leap into it too quickly, but 2 chapters in particular knocked me off my feet. And exactly like you said, I found myself in them. So the whole book was a delight, but I found myself in both initiation and dream, those 2 chapters. Yeah. And then as I was reading in dream, you kind of link it back to initiation. So I was like, so it makes sense that these are the 2 sort of in conjunction. In it, I mentioned that because in dream, you just have this very small sentence where you say you need to have fidelity to the dream.
Yes.
And we can talk about what you mean by dream, but actually I think that's such a beautiful thing, because there's an element where we need to have fidelity to the mystery, don't we? We need to have fidelity to the unexplainable. We need to sort of be brave enough to sit there and just have fidelity to the transcendent, and not sort of try and strip that away and have fidelity to something that's more comfortable.
Yes, I mean, I don't find much comfortable in Jesus, to be honest. Not really. Not really.
Yeah.
I find him, as I've said before, actually, I think it's almost the first thing we ever said. I find him the strangest of all the gods. Do you know, I was talking to someone the other day who said something very brilliant. They said, isn't it interesting? Lewis came to Christianity by recognizing the similarity between Christ and this ancient death, resurrection, dying king theme. And he said, you came to Christianity by recognizing the difference, not the similarities, but the difference. Yeah. And what I mean by that, and what this fella was rather cleverly pointing out, was actually, I don't find the Sermon on the Mount, I don't find the Beatitudes within the warrior spirit of the Greek myths, for example, I found him disturbing and hard to find. Now, to go back to the dream, I would have grown up, as we've talked about before, in lively evangelical Christianity, and a lot of good things are happening over there. But I suppose I would suggest they were probably more interested in the word vision than the word dream. And so I think one of the things in the book I make a bit of a distinction about is dream is, of course, moonlight, vision is sunlight. And so, in other words, words as powerful as mobilize. Let's mobilize the community. The Great Commission. That is all well and good, but as we know, and we see it in my little book, God uses dreams all the time. And the wonderful thing about dreams is they are uncorralled by us. We cannot edit them. We can't control. We do all sorts of outrageous things in dreams, and we just have to wake up and go, "Well, I'm very sorry about that," but it was my fault. So I do put an emphasis on dreams, and I remember talking to you before and saying, in a way, Christianity is a form of dream. Now, I don't mean that in some terribly vague way. I mean it in the kind of visionary, prophetic way where you wake up and say, "Oh God, I have to change my life. I have to change my life." I'm giving Christianity more weight and more power, but also just acknowledging that it has a phenomenally unknowable dimension as well.
So many bits that I kind of would love to draw out the book, and we kind of can't talk about everything, but I loved your chapter on prayer in the book, and you tell a great story about the fact that there was a chap that you were sort of on a retreat with, I think, and he was struggling with the whole concept of how do I do prayer, how do I make it meaningful. Tell us about the kind of the ritual you initiated, because it just struck me as such a genius thing to do.
Well, again, anything that's in the book, if it works for anybody, try it. Take it, distribute, multiply. So you can tell I've been reading the Old Testament. Multiply. So I realized a few years ago that praying, if you're not careful, it doesn't necessarily impact people much, especially if they're not used to it. So I was talking to a fella and I said, "Well, what has resonance and real meaning for you?" And he said, "I'm ashamed to admit it, but money does. Money does." And I said, "Okay, how much money would you have to rip up every time you made a prayer to remember that you'd made the prayer, to feel a kind of psychic significance?" And this is a few years ago, but I think even then it was probably about 20 quid. It may have been more. He was affluent. And I said, "Go on a walk, make a few prayers, and when you do it, tear the money up." It's not a sign of lack of respect for money or that you're beyond money, but it impacts and you're going to remember it. And sure enough, to be honest, once he started doing that, very strange things happened in his prayer life. And he suddenly realized that actually these prayers that we're firing out left, right and center are received. Now, what comes back from the prayer is not often what we anticipated, but there's usually a return message. So that was my thing. Now, the problem, Justin, for me is this became so popular that I was traveling around America once, and people are just ripping up money left, right and center. It's gone bananas. Now, they'd often come to the front at a gig. It was like a kind of big tent revival, and they rip up all the money, and I'd end up with all of it. Now, I can't get the sellotape out and fix these notes and put it in my own bank account. But I said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I will dispose of it all." And so I had not an envelope. I had a suitcase with probably at least $5,000 with ripped up notes in it. And I was at Rhode Island, I remember, about to catch the plane to New York back to England. And I got, as I always do, I get pulled out of the queue because people are thinking, well, is that Pablo Escobar? Is it Che Guevara? We don't know. There's something off about him. So I always get checked and second questions and all of that. And they were going to open the case, and I knew this was going to be a very, very strange moment because it's just filled with ripped up money. And funnily enough, I prayed at that moment, and I wasn't sure who I was praying to, but I said, if it's like a Jedi mind trick. If you can, we are not the droids you seek. If you can just get me through this, Lord. And he opened it up. He saw it all. Took a moment. looked at me and said, I'm not even going to ask, closed the case, gave it back, and I was off. So,
Make of that what you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a hilarious story, and that's probably why it's partly stuck in my memory. But I loved the fact that of this idea of doing something that costs you, and that's a very literal way in which ripping up a £20 note costs you something. What have you learned? I suppose it's interesting. You say this was. I'm not sure who I was praying to at that time. This was obviously a story that happened, as it were, before your your night in the woods that brought you to Christian faith. What would you say has changed for you when it comes to prayer? What's the sort of, perhaps even from the person you were when you were advising that young man and his struggle with praying?
I think one of the things that has changed is I now trust, whether I get to verbalize my anxiety or predominantly my gratitude, I trust that God already is fully aware of my inner workings. There is an argument, or not an argument, there's an idea really in Orthodoxy that the only thing you should be really praying for is how to articulate better your repentance. So rather than a shopping list of demands and please could you look after Auntie Bessie and blah, 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 repentance is fairly high on the list. I tend to have circling in my inner condition, inside my heart, something called the Jesus Prayer, which many of us will be very familiar with. It's in its simplest form. It's just this: Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And you repeat that for 3 minutes quietly and see what happens. It's not a mantra. It's not something to be sort of endlessly kind of slickly repeated. It's not going to put you in a trance state. You're not even recommended to think about an image as you're doing it. But what tends to happen is you suddenly find after a few minutes, it's as if the words are circling inside yourself, inside your own heart. And when, to come back to it, when I am awake at 3 a.m, when I am anxious or fatigued, when old Nick, old Scratch is circling the room, because he's delighted when we're anxious. It's the sweet spot. It's the sweet spot. That's what I do. So in other words, I live in the calligraphy of those beautiful words, and I know peace in it. So I suppose I've become, in a strange way, I'm less expressive about, oh, hi, God, I don't have that kind of just checking in, how are you, which I'm kind of familiar with. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I don't think you need to mediate contact with God through legions and legions and legions of saints and all of that. I think the Bible is clear that you have his isn't it astonishing? You have his full attention. You have his full attention. Wow. So my relationship to prayer has changed a little bit in those regards.
Gosh, yeah, there's the you wrote that line, didn't you? Sorry, this isn't a spoiler, but that line features in your concluding paragraph. We have Christ's full attention. Let's not waste it. And I had to sort of close the book.
I know.
No, it was just like, gosh, I know this, but I feel like I'm knowing this for the first time. Like, count to 10 and then read the final sentences. It was amazing. What I'm wondering is, so the chapters of this book, Liturgies of the Wild, and I should just say that in it you present us with stories that you kind of say have been thrown away or lost, these stories that you can hang your heart on, but also you tell us some of your own stories, and also then you just give it all time to breathe, and you just kind of let it all be and let people find themselves within it. And so you touch on things like I've already mentioned, initiation and dream. Justin has mentioned prayer. There's also envy in there and guilt, passivity, limits. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering, Martin, were there any chapters where, as you were writing them, you almost felt like you were kind of like performing your own heart surgery a little bit, where you were like, wow, this chapter has met me where I'm at, be that comfortable like a balm or deeply uncomfortable like a kind of rumbling? I'm just wondering, while writing this, because it's so, it really just like cuts through all the noise. So I'm wondering how that was to write and whether any chapter in particular felt that way.
Well said. You've got to have a dog in the race as a writer. You know it. You've just written a great book. You know, Justin's written a great book. You've got to have a dog in the race. There has to be some skin in the game. Otherwise, people sense it and it just glides. It's platitudinal. I think a chapter that is that has stayed with me is a chapter on death. There's a chapter on death, and in that chapter is a few stories about people that were very close to me that died. There would be a folk tale that talks about death. There'd be, again, a series of dreams I had around it. I think that chapter is particularly significant to me because, like everybody, I'm extremely ambivalent about the notion of death. And I'm afraid when I am at my most feeble, I find in a fundamental level the afterlife quite hard to hold on to because I'm not dead yet. You know, nobody's, you know what I mean? So I'm honest about that. The chapter that if you were to sort of say which chapter do you absolutely positively must read, right at the end, there's a chapter called On Praise Making. And that is a very important chapter to me. And quite honestly, I secrete into that chapter about 30 condensed ideas for every year I've been doing this. So that really, it's to do, I suppose, as I'm talking to you now, I'm thinking about maybe we live in a culture, maybe the stories that we experience a lot of the time are attempting their spell making. And the book is petitioning for prayer making. And spells and prayers are absolutely not the same thing at all.
Okay, can you break that open? That's very
Yeah,
intriguing.
I suppose I can. I would say, okay, I can this way. A spell is a seduction, but a prayer is a courtship. You know, we are the bride of Christ in a way. You're trying to appeal to something that is bigger than yourself. You're not a magician. You're not, scurrying around, working something in your favor. One of the difficulties of life is submitting to the complexities of your experience and knowing that God has allowed it. Terrible things, difficult things. And I've been, in my reading of the Bible recently, I've been thinking, whatever you do, don't get God's attention. Be careful. It's like, wow, okay. Oh, prayers, praise making is important to me because your capacity to praise is really, it's a connection to the word blessing. And most of us live in a culture where we receive affirmations, but we don't receive blessings. Now, an affirmation, of course, is a nice thing. Well done. You got a B+ in your essay. Not bad. But when you receive a blessing, the key to receiving it is you will know you've had it because suddenly you feel full in some way. And my concern in my own life and in others is that we are still waiting. Isn't it funny now? It's because my mind's in the Old Testament. We are all in a way, if like Jacob, you received a false blessing that wasn't really ever meant for you. It's meant for your brother. When you finally wrestle with the angel, as you do, as he does, he's going to say, I will not let you go until you bless me. And I wonder if many of us, and we could be well into middle age, are still waiting for a blessing that we actually haven't received, even though the world itself has probably affirmed us in all sorts of ways. That's good.
Wow.
That's why it's good to have conversations. That now.
I love seeing you put those dots together in real time, Martin. One thing that's struck me is that in this current season, actually, that this episode is the finale of, Belle did a great interview with a singer-songwriter called Nick Mulvey. Now, Nick is a slightly younger man than you, but has a similar sort of journey, having gone for a couple of decades, kind of very much looking into all kinds of different traditions, Eastern philosophies, and lots of other places. Always he had this very artistic soul, very and a seeking, for truth and for beauty and for meaning. And then only very recently, a couple of years ago, he found it in Jesus Christ, and it sort of led to a sort of evolution, change in his music. And Belle, you can probably put this better than me because you had the conversation with him. But what I heard in that conversation was you asking Nick, how do you kind of reconcile what you did find in those other traditions with where you are now, essentially saying, no, it really is expressed most beautifully, most concretely, uniquely in this new relationship, this peace, this joy I found in Christ. And I wondered whether you had gone on any similar journey. You know, we've obviously heard in the last episode the nature of that journey. But you also draw on so many different traditions, you know, those lots of different communities, spiritual communities or so that you've spent time with over the last few decades. And I know that one of the hard things about you becoming a Christian was, in a sense of betrayal that was felt by some of those communities, that you'd landed in this place. And I wonder how you've sort of, you know, engaged that. And the fact that you still obviously do see value in the stories that you've picked up along the way. How do you kind of square that with, as it were, where you now see the true meaning, the source of all that in the person of Christ?
Well, it's a case-by-case basis, I suppose, because I'm not a sort of general universalist. I don't think it always up the mountain are equal. I would say something that I've repeated many times before. I would be with Augustine when he says all truth is God's truth. So I think this is, as far as we can tell, and I think we really can tell this is a God with immense love for his peoples, and he is trying from any conceivable angle to let pinpricks of eternity into people's lives. And that has to include many, many people that never, ever came across Christianity in their life. So I think that kind of radiance can be detected anywhere. I would go back, actually, this may have even come, Justin, from a conversation you had with Tom Wright. I can't remember, but he said, imagine that you're catching a train. Do you remember this analogy from sort of Durham to Exeter? And a lot of the journey, even if you're going to London, it's all the same. It's all very similar issues and values and sort of civic duty, etc. But at a certain point at Paddington Station, I'm improvising now, you turn to the great primordial apple-heavy West, and things get a lot more site-specific at that point, and they're different. And that is what I would say is the distinction of Christianity. For me, it is immensely moving after the a la carte relationship to spirituality most modern people have now, where everything is available at the click of a Google. It is amazing, after being offered so many exotic meals, as it were, to settle back in midlife, not settle in a passive manner, but in a beautiful way. Settle back, I would call it, in the kayak of my ancestors, in the canoe of my ancestors, with my people. And who can believe that this rather odd Middle Eastern mystery cult has survived and has this extraordinary capacity to touch many, many different cultures as it makes its way around the world, and yet is telling a story of a very specific region. Again, as I've said before, I think one of the things that disturbed me about the Gospels, as opposed to, say, the Gnostic Gospels, was that they have a postcode attached. They're site-specific. You get a feeling of reportage. You get a disturbing sensation that something actually happened.
I mean, another aspect of this that comes through in the book is this sense that you're looking for a Christianity that is less tame. I mean, this came up in the story of your own coming to faith, that you'd sort of been given as you say, a Christianity that often shot the bird out of the sky, was somewhat boxed in. But it was all explained on a A4 sheet of paper, as it were. But then when you actually had this, you know, encounter with God, you found that sort of, that in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the mystery, the numinous, the sense in which this is an unraveling adventure that you can step into. How you know, and you've called your book Liturgies of the Wild. You're a man of the moors, the mountains, the woods, and so on. What does that look like, though, for the everyday person like me, who, you know, likes my cappuccino and, you know, it isn't very good at pitching a tent, quite frankly.
No, neither am I.
I mean, what does it mean to kind of, untame, rewild Christianity? And I suppose what you're trying to do by telling these specific stories in the purpose of doing that.
You'd have to have a big think about what the word wild actually means, because what often happens is the word wild in our head is far more associated with something like a word like feral. Or we think of wild as something that's perennially out of control. You'll be dead by 27. Think of Kurt Cobain and Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. I don't at all mean wildness in that way. I've said often that you can't draw Jesus with one line. You just can't. He's never where you expect him to be. He disturbs people frequently. That's wild behavior. And actually, when you are deeply invested in the things of this world, Christ's mandate is wild because it's so otherworldly. There's no doubt about it. He's saying very strange things. I was talking to my dad last night, and he said, I don't think ever people saw Jesus walking towards them and went, oh, that's Jesus. No. The event is about to happen. And the event is not designed necessarily to reassure. It's not designed to enchant. It's designed to wake you up. And so the wild, in the way, I have no desire to tweak endlessly the Christian story at all, because I'm old-fashioned and I believe that God speaks through those narratives and stories. But I would be a fan of why don't we be like Abraham and develop our sense of trust and faith that these stories, believe it or not, if well told, are still talking to us now and are actually portals into deeper experience.
I may have read this wrong, so you can tell me that this isn't sort of quite in there and I'm reading it in. But it feels like a real theme that holds the whole Liturgies of the World together is like the theme of maturation.
Yes.
Of maturing. And I think in that, and I think also it's been so much of a theme of everything you've said so far in our conversation, this sense, I think you actually write in the introduction, like you say to your readers, you are not grown. And that hit me because and this is maybe why like initiation is the chapter that sort of felt so pertinent. I feel a real deep sense at the moment to grow my own soul up, which is a phrase borrowed from Liz Oldfield. I feel very immature not in necessarily like the day-to-day use of that word, but in a deep sort of soul sense. And so I would just love you to speak into that theme, because I think that really is a theme that we've been circling around for this whole conversation. And like I say, is baked into the book, because you diagnose and you offer a prescription all at once in that kind of very, very forthright sentence, like you are not grown. So can you just maybe speak into that a little bit?
I would. So the first thing I would say is that I believe initiation is not just baked into the book, it's baked into Christianity. Okay. Christianity is an initiatory experience, and the thing it's trying to initiate us into gradually, painfully, beautifully is the mind of God, what we call theosis. So I think actually taking seriously the notion that Christianity itself, the life, death and rebirth of Christ, that is initiatory in its absolute essence. It's initiation writ large in real time. What I'd like to suggest to people watching this and people that may read the book is, say they're a bit old, they're not 17, say they're 40 or they're 50, they may think, well, a word like initiation, maybe something like that is too late for me. That's kind of passed me by. I'm not going to be wrestling with a lion. I'm not going to be joining Martin on the hill to fast in the woods for 4 days, although you can. Here's another word I'd like to bring in: tempering. Tempering. Now, tempering is it has less of the startlement of an initiatory experience, but tempering is something that, and in a way, I'm circling back to Justin's question about what does somebody living in a city, how could they better integrate some of these notions in their own life? Tempering it's like it's like water moving over a stone in a Dartmoor river. It just gradually works on you. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is trying to temper my concentration, because I noticed that in the last 2 years of smartphones and the rest of it, my concentration for reading seems to have been affected. And one of the things that I'm doing is about once a month, I sit down and for a few minutes a day, and it takes me a few days to do this, I learn 2 or 3 stanzas of a poem. And I don't interpret the words, I learn the words exactly. And the reason I'm doing it is because it's a word that pops up a lot in Liturgies of the Wild. I want to develop greater fidelity to certain things. There's an idea in the book of making a covenant with limit. One of the things that Orthodoxy is very good at is saying in a culture of feasting, it's not a bad idea to have some knowledge of fasting. So, you know, for somebody as gluttonous as myself, that's a good thing to slip into your religious life, that you're not just dieting out of vanity, you're dieting for to develop in the best way a poverty of spirit, a leanness of spirit, an awakeness of spirit. So, initiation, tempering. These things are very real. I would suggest, I'm afraid, that we live in an adolescent society for the most part. I think what is happening, and I won't go into too many details, but what is happening politically around the world is deranged. Absolutely, I'm just rendered speechless, especially when many of these politicians would claim to be, you know, Bible reading characters. I have no clue what is going on there. So in other words, I think culture is adolescent in a sense. It's forgotten its sense of service, and in a strange way, despite we're a sobering narrative, the West, because in a way we have everything, but we are aware we have some scarcity of spirit, some scarcity of soul. In some way we're lost in some fashion, you know. And of course, Jesus was nailing this 2,000 years ago with the rich young ruler. He's saying, you want to get serious? I'm glad you did all the building blocks of the, 10 Commandments and the rest. Now here's the stuff that's really going to melt your head.
Yeah, I mean, you're channeling somewhat your friend Paul Kingsnorth there. You know, he's obviously written at length recently about his concerns about the direction of culture in the way that we are simply allowing the machine to take over and dictate the way in which we communicate, the way in which we end up. Yeah.
Can I offer my suggestion to anybody that's read Paul's, very significant book? My suggestion would be become an angel in the machine.
And what does that mean?
What it means is, unless I would suggest you seriously limit your relationship and steward your relationship to technology. But if you are going to use it, like we're using it, or I have to use it for various things, commit, it's an old phrase, commit senseless acts of beauty with it. Subvert it. Because the reality is technology, medicine, the rest of it, it really is more a case of what you call the pharmacon. In other words, it has the poison and the remedy within it. And as soon as you just say, this is a bad thing, I want nothing to do with it, you've lost nuance and you have lost actually discernment. Go back to Paul, discern the spirits of the age. That's what you actually have to do. Have some discipline about it. But my notion would be, and it's simplistic as it sounds, be an angel in the machine. What all myths begin when you are outnumbered and outgunned. No story worth its salt begins when everything is okay, which means we live in wonderfully mythic times. Do not let an opportunity like this pass you by.
I love the idea of, as well, committing things to memory.
Yeah.
And it struck me as you said that one of the great advantages of technology is obviously we have the Bible at our fingertips. At any moment, we can pull up a verse or a chapter, but none of us ever commit it to memory, as perhaps previous generations did, because they didn't have that luxury of having a Bible at their fingertips in every moment. And there's something about actually remembering things and sort of letting them, like having them there, sort of cogitating away, that I suspect makes a big difference to when we sort of almost embody something by committing it to memory in that way. Just as you have committed many stories to memory, and so they kind of flow out of you. But I imagine you're not just reciting something; it's something that's living and breathing.
I'll tell you two. I've made a big decision. And it's taken me 4 years really to have the courage to begin this process. I entered Christianity partially through a very strange phrase that appeared in my head: inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. And eventually I thought, well, you're going to have to start thinking about that word Genesis. And so what I've begun, and I think this will take me the rest of my life, but what I've begun is simply beginning at Genesis, working my way through the entire Bible, and as best as I can, absorbing every story that I come to in the way I would tell Beowulf or a fairy tale. And that is an extraordinary process, because it does something very different in the psyche when those words are being chewed on in your own mouth. Now, I have to say, what I do is I'm very stringent in terms of I don't want to spin anything. I don't want to spin any of the stories for a modern polemic in any way. I just try and bear witness to them, but I do tell them in a way that's not chapter and verse. You know, I tell them like I tell a story. And I think this will be my next serious piece of work. And I think I wondered a few years ago, was I going to become a lay monk of some kind? Was I going to do this? I almost bought a monastery at one point. That's a whole other story. But what I really need to do is stay close to the living fire of these stories. And I'd recommend that for everybody. And I'd also recommend it, I have to say, for young Christians and people that may be watching this who've come into Christianity, possibly even through, say, the story of my mate Kingsnorth or me or others. Don't be so seduced that you become an expert in church history and you forget to read the Bible. Because I'm afraid I do locate that. The whole thing is so fascinating, and I love history myself, but there is something very odd going on in that big book. Have a look.
There's something as well. I think of that whenever I think of, when I think of what you're doing, and when I go back to stories that I've read. I've grown up in a Christian household, so literally my whole life. I think of that. I think it's Eliot's poem at the end of Little Gidding, where he says, "We shall not cease exploring. The end of our exploration will be to arrive where we began and know it again as new." I'm definitely paraphrasing. He said that more beautifully than that. But there's something about these stories, and you know it well. And it's not just these biblical stories, although, like, obviously as a Christian, I think there's something wildly mystical going on literally within the words. There's something about these stories that it's like we come back to them again and again and see something new within them. And again, it's sort of speaking to me of this sense of maturation and tempering, and just knowing that some of the deepest work in our lives is slow. And a bit like Abraham, actually, January tends to be my poetry month, because it just calms me down. So again, I've been reading Wendell Berry, and he says, what if prophet is sowing the seeds of a forest we will never see? You know, like, some things are so slow, they go beyond us. You know, the prophet is in the lineage of them. And I feel inspired again, even by you doing that. I've been like, this might take my whole life, and that's okay. To just come back to this point where I started and see it again as a new thing. It's so beautiful and so countercultural. It catches my eye with its difference, you know? Yeah,
it actually, it's the most awesome thing I've ever approached ever as a storyteller. And it frightens me, actually. Okay. It's the kind of fear that is healthy. It's not a fear of, you know, it's an awe, really. AWE, you know, it's awe. And you do feel very small and very mortal. And you think, well, I'll never get to the end of this, but this shall be my attempt. We are all born with an odd little set of skills. And as Rowan Williams said to me only 3 weeks ago, he said, when you meet God will not look at you and say, Martin, why were you not more like Martin Luther King? He won't even say, Martin, I put Mother Teresa in front of you and you weren't like her. He'll say, why were you not more like Bell? Why were you not more like Justin? Why were you not more like Martin? In other words, myth tells us in the end We're not to be anything we want. We're meant to be something quite specific. And that requires attention, focus, fidelity, tempering. And then you have a life worth salt.
It's been such a fun conversation. And it was always going to be Martin with you. I've left this to the end of the show because I think it sort of demonstrates a certain sort of anxiety, to use that word again, that some people have around this whole notion of storytelling. And I've been using the phrase myself in some of my podcasts and books about Christianity tells a better story than the materialistic one or the, all the other stories that are on offer, basically. Anyway, I had someone get in touch with me, an email from a listener, former atheist turned Christian. And I just thought she made a really interesting point. And I just thought, well, maybe I'll ask Martin this because he's a good storyteller. She said, I wanted to share a concern about the repeated framing of people returning to Christ in search of a better story. I was an atheist, and I didn't leave atheism because Christianity offered a more comforting or meaningful narrative. If atheism were true, I believe it would be morally right to accept it, however tragic that might be. I came to believe in God and in Christ because I became convinced they are real, not because the story is better. Of course, Christianity is a better vision of reality. A loving God who enters history, suffers and defeats death is immeasurably better than materialism or any impersonal ultimate reality, only if it is true. But if it were untrue, persuading people to believe it because it's psychologically or narratively appealing would, to me, be deeply wrong. My concern is that continually framing belief as quote-unquote seeking a better story risks undermining Christianity's central claim that this is not a therapeutic narrative, but a claim about what actually happened in history. To truth-seeking skeptics and former atheists, that language can sound like a concession that belief is driven by preference rather than by truth. I share your conviction that Christianity is true. I simply worry that this framing may unintentionally alienate the very people most concerned with truth over consolation. I'd just be fascinated in your response to that particular concern about this whole idea of the story-driven aspect of life and reality and indeed Christianity.
Yeah, I would concur with the gist of what she's saying. You don't want to pick a beautiful lie over the terrible truth, So I can see her concern, actually. And I've given it some thought myself. Funnily enough, I think if you were to create a story designed entirely to reassure, it wouldn't be Christianity. I think it's too weird, too difficult. The scale is so high of what Christ demands. I don't find it on its most profound level. Yes, there is enormous reassurance in it, but what it calls from us is enormous. People ask me sometimes, they say, all right, storyteller, you've now had 4 years washed in the blood of the slain lamb. What does it feel like to be in the 24-hour-a-day presence of your maker? And I say, well, it's a sense of perennial exposure. I think when we first met, I described it. I said, I feel like, I'm the temple and Christ is doing the audit, and he's kicking over the tables and he's lifting the lantern and he's going into rooms that I don't want him to go into. And that continues to this day, So actually, I agree with her. You don't want, in the Odyssey, there's an island called the Island of the Lotus Eaters. And if you eat the plant, then you feel warm, groovy feelings, but you never get home. Christianity is not a story of the Lotus Eaters. It is a story of far off Ithaca, further out, further in. You're going to have to go further. You're going to have to dig deeper. So I concur with her concerns, actually, and I would suggest we bear it in mind. I think it's a very salient point for her to make. However, in the end, I think we need a story that is simply bigger than us, and this is the biggest story that I have ever come across.
And it goes back to your thing, and you've said this at various points in this show and at other times. Christianity, yes, is in a sense a mythos, the greatest mythos, arguably, that's ever been told. But it's a story with a postcode and a very kind of specific instantiation. And I think that's the unique thing. That's, the thing Lewis recognized, and so many others who have had that great appreciation of the stories, is that it happened in a time and a place and a person. So I would want to say to this listener, absolutely share your concern if you were to sort of just completely separate Christianity, or the story of Christianity, from the physical events of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and that bigger story that you mentioned, this epic that we now find ourselves in as part of. That would be a tragedy, because it then does not become grounded in reality. But I suppose for me, the great news is we have a story that both speaks to, in extraordinary ways, to our imagination, precisely because it really happened, and that perhaps, but I have to say your book does just that job. So I would highly recommend this listener gets a copy.
Yeah.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you so much for being our final guest on this season of the show, Martin.
Absolute pleasure. Delighted always to talk to you both. Thank you.
Bless you.
Oh, it's such a delight. I do feel like Justin and I, whenever we get to talk to you, Martin, we get so excited that we just like unleash everything upon you. So it never... We come to the end of one episode and I'm always like ready for the next one. So here's to part 3.
Thank you.
Thank you as well, everyone watching and listening for season 8. Tell us what you've thought of this latest season. We'd be interested in your feedback. You can find out how to do that over at seenandunseen.com. And of course, people can help us to produce further seasons of this show, can't they, Belle?
You absolutely can, yes. Season 8 wouldn't have been possible without your generosity. And if you want to be part of making further episodes and seasons of Re-Enchanting happen, seenandunseen.com/give is where you can find the details for that. But I suppose until season 9, it is time for Justin and I to say goodbye.
God bless everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And Martin, thanks for being with us on today's episode.